From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. The global economy is declining, but the global media is not talking about Africa, with its 1 billion plus people, which is nearly 17% of the world population. The African Economic Outlook 2022 released by the African Development Bank says the pandemic and the Ukraine crisis are the biggest negative impacts. What are the gloomiest areas and what are the bright spots? How have China's engagements with African countries weathered through external shocks? To discuss more, I'm joined today by Sandrine Nduwimana, Director of International Liaison at China-Africa Business Council, and also by Professor Wang Jinjie from the National School of Development and Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development at Peking University. Ladies, welcome to the program. Sandrine, why don't I start with you? We've heard from the president of Ghana, for example, at the UN General Assembly recently, who is really doubting if there can be any major progress. It says identified some major areas of challenges, for example, a perfect storm of global economic chaos, a war with global consequences, and in his own words, unwillingness or inability to find a consensus to deal with all this. Talk to us about what's happening in Africa.
Yes, thank you, Wang Guan, for having me. Yes, so as the president mentioned, the world is truly currently not in a good place. The global economy is experiencing the steepest growth since 1970, and Africa is not any different. The report you mentioned has pointed out as the pandemic, Russia and Ukraine crisis being having the biggest impact on Africa's economy that could last several years, even a decade. So the same report, for example, predicts that, indicates that 30 million people in Africa were pushed into extreme poverty in 2021, that 22 million jobs were lost in the same year because of the pandemic, and this trend is expected to continue into the next year as well. So I could further summarize the findings of this report as well as a lot of the challenges pointed out in our own report at China-Africa Business Council that we released recently on Chinese investment in Africa from supply chain perspective. But I also like to point out that a crisis is often a wake-up call for all of us.
Right. You know, economic growth has a lot to do with jobs. Professor Wang, the job situation in Africa is not optimal, to put it mildly. In 2021, nearly 22 million jobs were lost due to the pandemic, and nearly 30 million people driven into extreme poverty in that very continent. And Africa, according to estimates, needs over $400 billion of additional finance. How do you see China's South-South cooperation initiatives helping Africa meet these objectives?
In terms of China's South-South cooperation, it keeps focus on development cooperation with Africa, as we all know. It has lent a strong boost to Africa's development, such as infrastructure for the industrialization process. As we can see, that China is making steady progress in implementing all the pledges it made for China-Africa cooperation. We all know that over $3 billion credit facilities pledged to African financial institutes, and nearly over $2 billion of loans were channeled to Africa's priority programs, and over $2 billion for Chinese companies' investment in Africa. All these facts prove that despite the evolving international situation, rising global crisis, China and Africa have stayed their course in enhancing cooperation, as just Sandrine mentioned as well.
Well, Sandrine, let me stay with you. You recently retweeted an article by the title of China may be a lot of things in Africa, but it is not a colonizer. Why did you retweet that tweet?
So look, Africa is a continent of 54 and 55 countries with over 1 billion people, like you mentioned at the beginning. And I wanted to point out the findings of the Afrobarometer polling results, which showed a stark split in their public opinion on what China is doing in Africa. And the most recent results show that China remained, despite everything happening, China remains second to the United States as a preferred development model for Africans. However, the survey also found that the majorities of those who are more aware of Chinese loans and development assistance, their countries are also concerned about being heavily indebted to China. But I also wanted to add a few points on the general analysis that the one that was published by Development Reimagined, because I think often when these things are discussed, when African debt is discussed, it's taken out of context, and people miss the big picture, and it often is misleading. It becomes more of a political tool rather than actual fact. So, for example, it's important to keep in mind even though, yes, the African external debt has been quite volatile, but especially rising quickly since the early 2000s, the entire African continent currently accounts for under 11% of all the low and middle income country debt globally. So the countries with the highest absolute debt levels on the continent are currently the largest economies. 5 African countries account for all of 50% of all African debt. And besides, I popularly believe China still accounts for just 8%, 8.7% of all the debt owed to by African countries. So there are many, many surprising facts about African debt that we obviously don't have time to unpack right now. But I wanted to stress again the importance of keeping things in context, thinking about poverty, extreme poverty, and the context and the needs that African countries still have and the needs for financing.
Professor Wang, according to International Nonprofit Center for Global Development, from 2007 to 2020, China's 2 main overseas development banks invested $23 billion in infrastructure projects in Africa. How do you see these projects benefiting either side?
I think this is a great question to think about as well. The reality is this is not only China, but also the rest of the world eyes on Africa. There are many reasons for that. One of it is Africa is the world's youngest continent. As we all know, over 60% of Africa's population under the age of 25. So Africa's youth is the continent's biggest resources. If harnessed well, Africa will grow tremendously. So about this issue, and I believe that I can further explain that by introducing our first-hand field study findings with you and the audience. In our research, we studied about 184 investors in the industry parks from 7 countries, 7 African countries. Our study discovered that the reasons for a company to invest in Africa are multiple. The reasonable price of labor force, good investing policies, and political stabilities and a safe environment are the top reasons to attract investors. And also they are facing challenges. They informed us lack of skilled workers, efficiency of the government, and efficiency of the logistics, and etc. are the top concerns. So in terms of this cooperation and investment, there are good signs and some challenges as well. But for sure, we can tell that there's very promising, and because of the improvement of the infrastructure, more and more Chinese investors and global investors are eyes on Africa right now. And we see prosperity in the futures coming up. Of course, we need to overcome a lot of issues along the way. Yes, Wang Guan.
Yeah, it sounds very promising. The fact that the majority of the African population are the youth, which
Yes.
of course offers huge potentials as consumer markets grow over there. Sandrine, one investor concerned about Africa, we've heard it all the time, it is the security situation over there. There have been a change of regimes by peaceful means sometimes, but on other occasions by violent riots and even coup d'etats. Besides, there's extremism, piracy on the seas, conflicts. How is Africa addressing those concerns? I guess Africa is not a monolithic whole, right? Sudan is different from Egypt, from South Africa, but overall, can you give us a sense of how is countries that you're familiar with dealing with the situation?
Perhaps because I speak as an African, I think I've always felt that security concerns have, even though they're real, they've always been overblown, especially in the media. So when you actually take a deeper analysis, you realize that in general, there are far more smoother leadership transitions and far more stable countries than unstable ones. And it is often the case that the same regions that experience a security crisis repetitively due to historical factors. So I would like to address this at first. However, like you mentioned, extremism specifically, as you mentioned, and also the Ghanaian president also spoke about it at the UN General Assembly, as well as attacks on Chinese projects and individuals has been a growing concern, which is why the appointment of the special Chinese envoy of Horn of Africa affairs was very, very welcomed by African governments and leaders, because it's not a fight that African alone can carry on their own, and it needs as much as support as possible.
Sandrine, how do you look at the evolving security cooperation between China and Africa? There has been this military base of China, the first of its kind, built in Djibouti, a military overseas base, what China calls a naval logistic support base. How do you look at that?
I look at it as a positive development. So I think seeing the investment from China to Africa has been growing significantly, meaning that the Chinese assets in Africa have grown and they need to be protected. I think it's natural that we want to put our resources, as much resources as possible, whether it's on the African side, whether it's on the Chinese side. So I think I view this as a positive. Africa needs a lot of support in maintaining the safety and security of its resources, its assets. And so the fact that we're seeing more discussions and more dialogue happening, even on security issues, I think it's a good progress, a good development.
Right, Professor Wang, let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. It is a huge plan, as China is providing more thought leadership around the world. It's not just a thought leadership, but it is putting it into action. By the end of April 2022, 52 African countries and the African Union Commission have joined China's BRI. How do you see this initiative benefiting or helping Africa?
Yeah, yes, as you mentioned about this BRI, I think infrastructure is the key for development. Taking the industry park as an example, it is a kind of infrastructure. So under the BRI, the investment and the donations and the financial capitals goes to the infrastructure. As for the industry park, it created a better business environment for investors, and also will create a more job opportunity for the locals. So I think the infrastructure are one of the fundamental key impacts of the economic development and international cooperation under the BRI. Another key impact is on human development, especially on human capital development. As I just mentioned in our field study in Africa, another finding is that over 45% of the investors we studied in our survey, they mentioned the lack of skilled workers. So the skill imbalance and the mismatch between education and the need of the labor market are very obvious. So how to promote the investors, how to guide the investors under the BRI policy and under the government policy, so they can deliver a spillover effect, which is a force that cannot be ignored, because they act as the skilled training hubs for the local employees, training the local employees to become urban workers. So China and Africa cooperation under BRI should focus on these key issues: infrastructure, human development, deeply understand the major challenges faced by different countries, especially in the field of a good quality of human capital. So that could achieve a win-win for both China and Africa in the long run. Yes,
Professor Wang, there are practical challenges, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic. Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi recently talked about, in his words, strong shield against COVID-19 built together by China and Africa. What exactly do you think he meant by that?
I think from the data we can tell China has provided close to 200 million doses of vaccines to African countries. And we see that the Africa CDC headquarters building will be completed soon, estimated maybe in the near year. and upgrading of different hospitals in African countries like South Sudan, Chad, and Malawi. Those are all very good signs of this strong shield built together by China and Africa. Another key factor, which I just mentioned, is to build a strong shield for the health of the African people, is to foster the medical human resources. For example, Africa international students are studying in China. They study in the higher education institutes. Medical fields related to educational exchange and vocational education cooperation between China and Africa are largely needed. So preparing the medical experts and human resources are quite crucial for this strong shield building as well.
Finally, let me ask both of you this question. What are your expectations from this year's CPC Party Congress, especially chapters or goals or initiatives related to South-South cooperation or China-Africa cooperation? Let me start with you, Sandrine.
So here I will perhaps maybe speak from someone who works at China-Africa Business Council, where most of our activities are actually between China and African countries. So before the pandemic, we traveled a lot, we cooperated a lot. We traveled from China to Africa, Africa to China a lot. And we had meetings happening in Africa. We had Africans joining us here in China. So it will be good if something along the lines of those borders being open will be definitely something that is wanted. A lot of the slowing of the economies or interactions are due to the fact that we have not been able to see each other face to face, or those meetings have been made a little more difficult. So I think the biggest expectation for someone who used to travel a lot will be, maybe we can hope to start traveling again next year.
Yeah, let's hope. Let's all hope. Professor Wang, what do you think?
I think one thing for the future and expectations we ensure is that mutual development and mutual learning will be the hardcore for the next step, and for nowadays cooperation as well.
Yeah, Professor Wang, you talk about the fact that multilateralism is helping Africa instead of hurting it. But we've heard from Washington, whereby the Biden administration, for example, is saying that it will counter harmful activities by the People's Republic of China and Russia and others in Africa. How do you look at those claims, and how is Africa balancing its relations with the West versus those with China?
Especially, nowadays, under the uncertainty of global relations, the changing is day by day. So for either bilateral, multilateral, or trilateral, it's a choice and the freedom of African countries itself, and also the freedom and the rights for other countries as well. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your field trips to Africa and your research in this area. And Sandrine, thank you so much for joining us as well at this hour. Thank you both. The Republic of Djibouti may be small, but it is a huge opportunity. Its strategic position on the northeast coast of Africa makes it a gateway to the Suez Canal, one of the world's busiest shipping routes. What makes this Horn of Africa nation so important to China? Eminent economist Dr. Abdoulkader Houssein Mohamed joins me from Djibouti to talk about all this. He's with the Institute of Political and Strategic Studies under Djibouti's Ministry of Higher Education and Research. Dr. Mohamed, welcome to the program. Let's talk about China-Djibouti relationship. This diplomatic relationship started in 1979, just a year and a half after Djibouti gained independence from French colonial rule. In your opinion, how have bilateral ties evolved?
The relationship between China and Djibouti is a very long-standing relationship. At the beginning, started with the diplomacy, opening embassy, and also having some cultural ties. But later on, it has become multi-dimensional ties. When country gain independence, it needs the support of other countries and international organizations to start over. And China responded positively.
Like you said, it is certainly a multidimensional relationship, but if you read Western headlines, the spotlight focuses on the fact that China built one of its first overseas military bases in none other Then the region of Djibouti, it's a seaport over there, what China describes as a logistical support facility over there. How do you look at the facility, and how is the Chinese military port there received by locals?
First of all, it's related to Djibouti's strategic location. It's at the crossroad of three continents, Africa and Europe and Asia. It's the second most important emerging world in the world. And the other thing is also Djibouti is a very stable country and a peaceful country, unlike other countries in the regions. Since there is also existing threat in the regions, for example, I can mention piracy, terrorism, and other threats. And it is logical that China or other countries open military bases in Djibouti. And what's other is important, this is not also the agreement made with Djibouti, because Djibouti have good issue with China in the US and other countries. So when they open base in Djibouti, they have some condition to respect and to abide by. Then that condition is to have strictly respect the objective set by two governments.
But why do you think some Western commentators and Western politicians kept saying that China is doing neo-colonialism in countries, including yours?
When they see that the modern day colonialism, I think this is wrong, because we have, as I said, winning partnership, first and foremost. And secondly, we have also mutual interest and a mutual benefit. So that's a misconception that built by Western countries. And the other thing they use to back up that idea is about debt. They said it's a trap to the diplomacy. It's not true, because the debt is still sustainable in Djibouti, and also it was invested in the economy sectors, like like railway, also other areas. That those sectors itself will generate revenue that will, in return, help to pay back those credits. So it has nothing to do. There's no debt, and also China allowed Djibouti or other African countries to renegotiate if they cannot pay back in due time. Both countries respect the general rule of market. The idea of colonialism is completely false.
All right, Dr. Mohamed, let's talk about the economy of Djibouti. There are so many blueprints for the country's future growth. For example, Vision 2035, that is a development blueprint that is set to triple your country's per capita income by 2035. Certainly a very ambitious set of targets. And also Djibouti is setting up this international free trade zone. How do you think has Djibouti's economy developed under these new projects and initiatives?
For Djibouti, the expected scenario of development by 2035. The first step was to promote job and economic growth. And that we are in the halfway between 2015 and 2019. The economic growth basically is between 5 and 7% for Djibouti. So this is a reality, and nobody can deny this. And the other thing is also, in order to support economic growth and development, Djibouti has to have infrastructure. And with the help of China, with the partnership of China, Djibouti has built, I think, unlike other African countries, many infrastructures that support economic activity. So that's also a success story you can relate to 2035 visions. And unfortunately, the only thing we can say we did it halfway is in terms of job creation. The latest figure said job unemployment is about 47%, and we are supposed at the end of that 5 years plan to achieve 38%. So, but still now we finish with that one plan. Now we go with the new plan. So that's for Vision 2035. for international free trade area, first, what is it? It is to make Djibouti a logistic hub for the regions and for Africa and for the world. And we expect to create in that activity 200,000 jobs, and we hope we will meet that objective. And Djibouti is a main stakeholder, around 60%, and also China also one of the stakeholders.
Djibouti-Ethiopia Railway is a signature project of the region in East Africa. It is also considered part of the Belt and Road Initiative. How do you think the Belt and Road Initiative at large and this railway in particular has helped locals?
Djibouti has to use either maritime transshipment or road to either import or export goods from Djibouti or Ethiopia or any other countries. This is another way to make trade with neighbor countries, especially Ethiopia. And the train improve and increase the volume of goods that going between Djibouti and Ethiopia. And the people also can travel very easily rather than taking cars or plane. They can use railway as a place to move, and they have it's less expensive, and it has been a major project for locals.
This November, Djibouti will participate in the China International Import Expo in Shanghai for the first time ever. What can we expect from Djibouti's presence? I mean, what is Djibouti expecting from the expo?
They can expect from that to exhibit and also to show all the assets we have in terms of fishery, in terms of tourism. Djibouti will also have maybe a possibility to convince some investors, some entrepreneurs, especially Chinese entrepreneurs, to know better Djibouti and to invest in Djibouti.
All right, Dr. Mohamed, finally, I know that you studied in China. How has your experience changed your perception about China and the Chinese people?
I had a very good opportunity to travel to pursue my PhD study in China, and I also have expectation in terms of what I'm going to study in my project in PhD. Journal University of Economics and Law, and I hope and I greet them if they can see me. And it is one of the best university I saw and I studied there. I have also opportunity to learn Chinese language and to interact with Chinese people, are very friendly people, and I took away very positive of my stay in China for my PhD in Wuhan City. So that's a very good experience.
Dr. Mohamed, thank you so much for joining us. Come back again.
Thank you for having me.
That will do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you so much for joining us. Our news coverage continues on CGTN. Bye. Take care.